In case you're new to this channel, you're gonna need some context. Back in February of 2019, I put out a video titled The Most Profound Moment in Gaming History. The moment in question was a scene at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Naturally, with a declarative title like that, I was going to invite people who disagreed with my choice and wanted to propose either an alternative moment or game that they felt was more profound. In the interest of being intellectually honest, I wanted to play as many of the games that people suggested and contrast them with Metal Gear Solid 2, to see if there was a game or a moment that might transcend it. I have spent the past 5 years doing that on this channel, and during that period, I have not encountered a single moment that I believe is more profound. But I have encountered 2 games that I feel were more profound on the whole. One was the original Deus Ex, which I believe is the most important game ever made, for both its prescient story and the way its game design influenced so many games that came after. However, if I'm speaking just about profundity, I do place one game above Deus Ex, that of course being NieR Automata. While I have publicly expressed this belief once or twice over the past 5 years, I've not qualified that belief as comprehensively as I would like, and now I think it's time to make my case. First, I think it's worthwhile establishing a commutual definition of profound, because that word can mean a lot of different things to different people. In my case, I draw upon the Merriam-Webster definition of profound, meaning to have intellectual depth and insight, although I personally add the adjective emotional to that definition. So when I define a game as profound, I do not refer to its overall quality. I strictly refer to its insight into emotional, philosophical, and other intellectual matters. Now, I do not believe that NieR Automata is the greatest in any single one of these categories. I do not believe its content is more philosophical than games like Disco Elysium or Planescape Torment. I do not believe it is more intellectual than the aforementioned Deus Ex or something like Xenogears. I do not believe it has the same emotional highs as games like Shadow of the Colossus or The Last of Us. But that said, I do believe NieR Automata is the greatest accumulation and balance of all those and other categories. In short, NieR Automata takes the entire corpus of existential philosophy and distills it into parabolic form, making the core ideas of that philosophical tradition accessible to every type of person. Granted, this distillation forces NieR Automata's examination of these ideas to not be as expansive or as complex as they are in games like, say, Pathologic 2 or the Talos Principle. Nonetheless, the core meanings of these ideas, along with their often emotionally gut-wrenching content, are preserved, despite their simplification. The reason why NieR Automata invokes so much existentialist philosophy is because, at root, the game is trying to answer the most important philosophical question of the past millennium. And it makes this attempt by throwing every existential idea at it like the pods shoot energy balls. It is a spiritual question that we continue to struggle with in the present due to its intellectual and emotional difficulty. And it's one we must come to a consensus on soon, for if we don't, our reality could see its reflection in this game. I will lay out that philosophical question and the various genius ways in which NieR Automata attempts to address it, but before I do, a quick word on spoilers. The first half of this video will be spoiler-free, save for a synopsis of the game's story and setting. I will give ample warning before I go into the second half, where I detail specific characters and storylines. If you have to dip out, make sure to bookmark this video and come back to it when you're done. In order to outline the depth and scope of NieR Automata's core philosophical question, we first need to go back roughly 400 years. There was a time in the Western world when publicly questioning or criticizing religion was a crime punishable by death, but the sole reason was not due to a baseline fealty to God. One of the biggest reasons was a belief that doing so was deleterious to the fabric of society. I believe that the English Lord Chief Justice of 1676, Sir Matthew Hale, summarized this argument best when sentencing a blasphemer to death. To criticize religion was to undermine the laws of society. What he meant by this is that Western civilization's social cohesion rested on a belief in two core things. One is that humans were flawed and broken, but the second is that by trying to emulate God, specifically the ideal set by Jesus Christ, one might redeem their flawed nature. This was the meaning of life for centuries in the West, the meaning that enabled people to contend with life's immeasurable suffering. But in the next few centuries, seeds would be sown that would inevitably uproot this philosophy. The Reformation was arguably the first of these seeds. In case you don't know, the Reformation was an intensely conservative religious reaction by a segment of Christians against the Catholic Church. Though it was a movement motivated by many factors, particularly what was perceived as corruption within the church, I will focus in on the one reason most relevant to NieR Automata. The segment of Christianity that would go on to define themselves as Protestants retaliated against the influence that the famous Italian priest, Thomas Aquinas, had on their theology. Specifically, his attempt to marry Christianity with the Aristotelian spirit of reason. The Protestants, led by Martin Luther, believed that God had absolute sovereignty over our existence, and any attempt to introduce reason into that would undermine God's plan. This, alongside many other reasons, led to a theological split between the Catholics who embraced reason and the Protestants who did not. For the next century and a half, the Enlightenment philosophers who embraced reason warred over whether or not it should be married with faith in a higher power, or if reason negated the existence of God entirely. Philosophers like Spinoza and Diderot believed that a radical embrace of reason alongside a negation of God would be the foundation of the West's new social order. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and John Locke, though believers in reason, were skeptical about the human capacity to operate purely on reason without God, given our inherently flawed nature. This ideological divide would become exacerbated by the political revolutions that characterized the era, like the French Revolution and the European revolutions of 1848. Radical rationalists saw these revolutions as a concrete expression of social progress, while more conservative thinkers saw the bloodshed of these wars as proof of the insufficiency of reason. As the philosopher Edmund Burke argued, humans have neither leisure nor knowledge sufficient to reason right. Will not honest instinct prompt and wholesome prejudices guide them much better than half reasoning? Then came the coroner of this ideological war, the one whose philosophy sits at the foundation of NieR Automata, Friedrich Nietzsche. He, a famous atheist, determined that the fruits of the Enlightenment and the advent of science had killed any credibility that religion once had, particularly of Christianity. Thus, he made the famous proclamation that God was dead and we have killed him. Though some who adopt the Spinozian spirit saw this as a positive, triumphant declaration, Nietzsche was far more pessimistic, even displaying sympathy for the likes of John Locke's perspective in this regard. Though he felt that humans would have to create their own values in a world that was devoid of God or meaning, he didn't think that we would be able to do it due to our inherent imperfection. Thus, he predicted in his book, The Will to Power, that attempts to craft our own values would result in bloody conflict, a prediction that came to frightening fruition in the 20th century. This is an incredibly basic overview of an enormous philosophical problem with no universal answer, and yet, NieR Automata boldly decided to build its world and story around it.
Everything that lives is designed to end. We are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. Is this a curse? Or some kind of punishment? I often think about the God who blessed us with this cryptic puzzle, and wonder if we'll ever have the chance to kill him.
These opening lines are a perfect summation of this ideological conundrum. It encapsulates the resentment that arises from this need for God to give meaning to life's suffering, despite the fact that this God, if he exists, remains invisible and silent. In his absence, one has four choices. One can continue to seek God, one can seek symbolic revenge against God by destroying his creation, one can die, or one can attempt to create their own meaning. NieR Automata uses its story to explore these four options, showcasing their merits and deficits. Not only are these arguments easily digestible in their parabolic structure, the game's story writer, Yoko Taro, introduces an element that provides innovative insight to this philosophical problem. Instead of having humans debate this issue, he has robots and androids debate it 10,000 years in the future. The year is 11,945 AD. The remnants of humanity have been living on the moon for the past 5,000 years. Their current circumstances were spurred by the arrival of an alien race that attempted to wipe out the human species, which they did via the creation of antagonistic machine life forms. Roughly 200 years after this escape to the moon, the humans launched their counteroffensive. They created an elite military force of advanced androids to fight on their behalf. However, since their initial pushback in 5204 AD, they have yet to break the stalemate between the alien-created machines and the androids fighting on humanity's behalf. For the first half of the game, we play as two androids, one named 2B and another named 9S. In their journey to destroy the machines and save humanity, they will interact with various allies and enemies, most of whom are dealing with their own existential woes and trying to solve them in their own way, usually by echoing the philosophy of an existentialist or a prominent figure from the Enlightenment era. Before I analyze those characters and the ways their philosophies are showcased, I do want to add a couple of extra thoughts on the game's presentation and setting. It is very typical of Yoko Taro to use opposing elements in a game in order to provoke the gamer to think. In his first directorial effort, Drakengard, he would take common action game tropes and flip them, like make our supposed heroes villains, or have the characters constantly chastise us for killing our enemies. In the first NieR game, the story would frame certain events in order to make us perceive them one way, and then introduce information later that betrayed that original perception. This trend continues in NieR Automata by telling a story about androids and robots as a way to comment on humans and their nature. Their attempts to emulate or interpret human thoughts and behavior are done clumsily, often to humorous effect. This immediately puts the gamer in a philosophical mindset, making them wish they could interject and either suggest the correct way to behave or at least an alternative. However, there will be times where the game challenges this desire to interject by introducing a philosophical conundrum that has no clear answer. Then, in our attempts to provide an answer, we end up struggling in a way that is equally as clumsy, which in turn breaks down the divide between man and machine. Ultimately, a game about mechanical life forms becomes ironically one of the most human games ever made. Finally, I just want to comment on the way the game's world fosters that aforementioned philosophical mindset. Taking a page from games like Journey, Dark Souls, and Shadow of the Colossus, there are many times where the game will provoke feelings of depressive isolation as you run around its desolate, dilapidated world. As the soft, ambient music plays, you cannot help but reflect on why the world around you ended up the way it is now, what philosophies led to its destruction, and what part your beliefs might play in its future. Though your journey through the barren landscape might not invoke the peak emotional highs from those aforementioned games, it does foster some of the best transcendental meditation that you can receive, be it from a game or any medium. At this point, I would like to detail the ways in which the game's various characters address the game's underlying philosophical question. But before I do, I will issue that promised spoiler warning. If you have not played NieR Automata, please do not spoil for yourself this unique, masterful work of art. Please pause this video and go play it as soon as you can. Taking a cue from a deeply profound game like Xenogears, most of the character names in NieR Automata are references to real-life philosophers and other intellectuals. And just like Xenogears, sometimes those references can mean absolutely nothing or absolutely everything. In the case of machines like Hegel or Marx, their names reference the German philosophers George Wilhelm Hegel and Karl Marx, but their respective idealist and socialist philosophies bear very little, if any, impact on the game's overall story. However, machines like Simone, Kierkegaard, and Immanuel are very relevant to the game's main theme. Now very quickly, before I explain why they are relevant, I do want to make one last comparison to Xenogears. Though that game is an undeniable masterpiece, its attempts to reference various complex ideas from various subjects did make it too ambitious for its own good. Though it fulfilled most of its ambition, I do think its true depth is probably lost on people who do not have a basic grasp on psychoanalysis or esoteric religious traditions like Gnosticism and Kabbalah. In contrast, NieR Automata focuses mostly in on just philosophy, and distills a variety of complex ideas into a mostly accessible form, all while not compromising any of their majesty. The best way to set things up is with the story of Immanuel. One day, 2B and 9S encounter a kingdom of machines in the forest. This kingdom broke off from those warring against humanity and the androids, wishing to pursue their own destiny. Initially, this kingdom was established by a robot named Ernst, who ruled as king for 128 years. One day, Ernst dies, and supposedly has his consciousness transferred into a baby robot model. The robots of the Forest Kingdom expect this baby to grow just like a human does, but after another 128 years pass, they finally realize that the baby is not growing. Huh, really? Took you a century to notice that? The name Immanuel is a reference to the aforementioned Immanuel Kant, and in this case, his philosophy of the thing in itself is being invoked. To Kant, he believed that human beings were unable to perceive the world around them as it actually is, due to their inherent imperfection. In effect, they could only create semi-corrupted representations for themselves, but never truly perceive the thing in itself. Like I mentioned before, this is one of many examples of the machines trying to understand and emulate human behavior, but clumsily doing so. They are unable to perceive the robot baby as it truly is, thinking it is just like a human baby that will grow. Though we see the error in their thinking, we are not so different from them, in that our understanding is also limited by our imperfect bodies and minds. Now, if perception is limited, one can logically infer, as Kant did, that this applies to human reason and the ability to create one's own values. This view is justified via many characters in the game. In the case of the character of Simone, she tries to give her life meaning by beautifying herself in order to garner the love of a robot named Jean-Paul, a striving that was antithetical to the feminist beliefs of the philosopher she was based on, Simone de Beauvoir. In the case of the character of Kierkegaard, he promises his overzealous religious followers that they will become like gods through rituals. This was the exact opposite of the real Kierkegaard, who, though an ardent Christian, was against collectivist Christianity and dogmatic rituals. On and on, every character fails to create their own values through reason, as Nietzsche believed we needed to do. Ironically, one might reason from this, as Kant, Locke, and Burke did, that reason without God to guide us is insufficient. Though NieR Automata makes a strong case for that, it makes an equally strong case for the opposing argument, and the primary exhibit is the character Pascal. He is named after the French proto-existentialist Blaise Pascal, who is most famous for his philosophical argument known as the wager. Pascal likens belief in God to a sort of coin toss. Either God exists or does not exist. He believed that it was better to believe God exists and act as if God will judge you for your morality upon death. That way, when you die, you will go to heaven if he does exist. If he doesn't exist, then you will lose nothing upon death. To believe he doesn't exist when he does would, theoretically, equate to an eternity in hell. Though this seems like a reasonable argument at first, Yoko Taro quickly eviscerates it when applying its logic to an artificial consciousness. Unlike with humans, a machine's consciousness would not go to heaven upon death, because their mind does not share a theoretically divine link to the natural world.
So dark. So cold.
The inference from this is that there is no transcendent reward to acting morally in this life for a machine. So, what is to stop them from giving into feelings of resentment and murderous hatred when life gets too painful? This question is explored with the robot Pascal. He was a pacifist machine who, like the members of the Forest Kingdom, split off from the warring machines in order to pursue peaceful coexistence with the androids. Though this peace is maintained for the majority of the game, it is upset when the leaders of the androids infect their troops with a logic virus, causing them to become mindless yet more effective berserkers when making a final push on the machines at the end of the game. This logic virus spreads to the machines and causes them to attack one another. Thankfully, Pascal manages to save a selection of child machines from the virus and others infected by it. But when Pascal returns to the child machines, after successfully fighting back the infected, he discovers the most horrifying thing imaginable. All the children ran themselves through, out of fear of what might happen if the infected machines found them. But the horror of the situation and the despair it brings Pascal are not the worst parts. Rather, it is the guilt Pascal feels for teaching the machine children the concept of fear. Their fear brought them to despair, and that despair made them end their lives. With this unimaginable pain, Pascal decides he cannot go on living, so he asks the player to either kill him or wipe his memory, which you can either refuse or accept. Now, it's easy to say if you're religious that self-termination out of despair is a sin. Even if you aren't religious, it's easy to say that the moral choice is to find a new meaning to strive for. But in that moment, when the ones you love lie dead before you, and you feel overwhelming guilt for this occurrence, those principles easily become negated, especially when you're a machine whose actions theoretically have no religious consequence. In times like these, one can see the utility that a belief in God could have to keep somebody from giving in to despair. But when that God is silent, when that God does not show you a way to deal with that unbearable emotional burden, then the temptation to curse God and his creation becomes too great. In the worst cases, that resentment takes the form of revenge against God. For Pascal, that revenge was self-termination, but for others, it can be mass slaughter. In the case of the character 9S, he suffers 2 existential blows that put him on a murderous crusade. Later on in the game, he uncovers unsettling information, which suggests that the Council of Humanity on the Moon was established by the android military, when it should be the other way around. When he confronts his commander about this, She casually and quickly confirms the information's validity, leaving no time for 9S to make the logical deduction that humanity has been extinct for thousands of years. But why the lie? Well, if you don't have something to fight for, to strive for, then what's the point of going on living in this war-torn, miserable world? And now 9S, somebody who has fought his entire life for humanity, finds out that all his efforts were for naught. Worse yet, when he goes to tell 2B, the android that he not so subtly had strong feelings for the entire game, she is mercifully killed by the android A2 after she was infected with the logic virus. Naturally, having his two sole reasons for living eliminated in the same day was too much for 9S to handle, and he figures the only way he can justify his continued existence is killing as many machines as he can, as a symbolic form of cosmic revenge. With these various characters, NieR Automata illustrates the impossibility of this philosophical conundrum. One can try to create one's own values without God, but the game shows multiple incidences where this goes wrong on account of human, or in this case, mechanical imperfection. But embracing God's existence has its own problems as well, and can lead to things like zealotry or misinterpretation of gospel, or resentment at God when the pain of life becomes too much to bear. Ultimately, the right choice forever eludes us, and if there is a God who cursed us with this cryptic puzzle, the confusion and pain that arises from seeking an answer in vain would be enough to make somebody want to kill him. Though there are other games that tackle this type of existentialism in very powerful ways, games like Soma, Pathologic 2, none of them manage to cover as much ground as NieR Automata does, while also making the ideas accessible to a variety of audiences and preserving their intense emotional difficulty. It is a comprehensive yet paradoxically simple summation of centuries of philosophy, all within a parable about machines. But I think the best thing of all is that the game was bold enough to be honest about the problem, to acknowledge that neither side of the debate has an all-encompassing answer, and furthermore, it trusted that the gamer would know how to respond when all the information was given to them. At the end of the game, when the androids and machines are all dead, the credits will begin to roll. At this point, you can engage in a minigame where you can try to shoot all the names in the credits while dodging incoming attacks. Quickly, the gamer will realize the literal impossibility of shooting all the names without dying. When you do die, messages will pop up on screen. At first, these messages will taunt you, asking you to accept defeat or admit that your actions are meaningless. But after a few attempts, you will begin to receive messages from real people, real gamers from all over the world, encouraging you to keep going. If you choose to continue, the gamers who came before you will lend their data in the form of extra power, enabling you to defeat all the names in the credits. Before the game ends, you are offered the chance to help somebody else in the way that those other players helped you. But in order to do so, you have to sacrifice your save data. If you're inclined to do this, the game will remind you that this will be a thankless act. The person you are helping might be somebody that you would intensely dislike if you met them. Still, you are invited to make a loving, compassionate sacrifice for a complete stranger. After playing a game that made you stew for so long in the misery of existence, in the possibility that life truly is meaningless, maybe life is nothing but pain, with no transcendent purpose. But in this moment, you can choose the one thing that might have the power to transcend even that potential reality. And as simple as it might seem, that thing is love. No other game has made me feel as much despair or as much hope as NieR Automata did. For that alone, I would consider it the most profound game of all time. But there are all the other aforementioned layers, amongst others that I wasn't able to fit into the flow of this video. But at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. I invite all of you to continue to argue for alternative games in the comments section below. But please, we're all video game fans here. Please be civil and constructive with your comments. Please give this video a like if you liked it, that helps me out a lot. And make sure to check out either of the videos you see on screen now for more NieR related content. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.